Fans may not be the only ones rallying against Commanders owner Dan Snyder, and apparently Jimmy Garoppolo was almost the guy Washington wanted before it wanted Carson Wentz. More on those stories and more right now on the Locked On Commanders podcast.
Your daily podcast on the Washington Commanders, part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Your team every day.
Welcome, Commanders fans, to the Locked On Commanders podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. We are your daily podcast covering the Washington Commanders, and we are free and available on all platforms, including YouTube and the WUSA 9 Plus app found on your Roku or Amazon Fire Stick. And we thank you for making us your first listen or view of the day. I'm David Harrison. My co-host is Chris the Rooster Russell, both of us credentialed media covering your Commanders. Chris for the Team 980, where you can find he and Pete Medhurst live from 9 a.m. to noon Eastern, Monday through Friday, or anytime on the Audacy app. And you can find me over at Commander Country, part of Sports Illustrated's Fan Nation, where I am writing about Carson Wentz and your Washington Commanders. But Chris, we're not going to talk Carson Wentz just yet, or the potential pre-Carson Wentz discussions. We're going to talk Dan Snyder to start off today's episode.
Yes, we are, because we didn't get a chance to address it in our post-game edition because there was so much to talk about from the brutal 24-8 loss to the Eagles. But before we get there, today's episode of Locked On Commanders is presented by Prize Picks. Our friends at Prize Picks, if I could speak in English, is daily fantasy made easy. David, here's what you do. You pick between 2 and 5 players, and if they score more or less than their Prize Picks projection, you can win up to 10 times your money on your first entry. And first-time users can receive a 100% instant deposit match up to $100 if you use the promo code Locked On. That's prizepicks.com with the promo code Locked On. All right, so here we go. This hit on Saturday early afternoon. Again, we teased it. We didn't get a chance to talk about it because there was so much going on. It was impossible to get everything in. But David, in the Washington Post, story written by Nikki Javala, Liz Clark, Mark Maskey, they combined. Obviously, they have many resources to dig, and Maskey's been covering the league as a whole, so he knows a bunch of owners, right? Basically, the nuts and bolts of the article were, quote, multiple owners said in recent days that they believe serious consideration may be given to attempting to oust Dan Snyder from the league's ownership ranks, either by convincing him to sell his franchise or by voting to remove him. And then the article went into individual unnamed owners who basically said, look, the one owner, much stronger than other owners, let's just put it that way. He said, quote, he needs to sell, end quote. And then another quote, some of us need to go to him and tell him that he needs to sell. Before we get into all the other parameters, when you hear that, when you think about that, with all the rumors, with all the smoke, with all the stuff that we've heard, do you think this is a bigger deal? And we have moved into a different level and a different layer of the Dan Snyder saga, or is this more of the same?
I feel like to reference a Marvel cinematic masterpiece. So for all of the Marvel fans out there, you're going to kind of understand. I think we're entering the end game. I think that's what's happening here, right? And I'm just gonna apologize up front if I butcher this whole thing. I'm a fan of Marvel, but I'm not as big into Marvel as some people are, so I apologize if I butcher this. But basically, listen, we're entering the end game of this Dan Snyder situation, I believe. However, let's not forget that the last 2 Marvel movies in that phase of the Marvel cinematic projects, which were the End Game and Infinity Wars and all that stuff, they lasted a really long time. Like they still lasted a really long time, but I think everything's kind of coming to a head. Like what needs to be known is known, right? Investigations have been done, statements have been collected, data is inferred. Like who has Dan violated, or who is Dan's organization violated in some way, shape, or form according to accusations? Employees, fans, other NFL owners. I don't know himself. Like somehow Dan probably ripped off himself. I'm not really sure how he did that, but he probably did it some way somehow, right? Like. I mean, the laundry list of things that he's accused of. I don't think there's any more discovery necessarily left to be done. And if there is, Chris, like I don't know what's left to be discovered that he hasn't already done. Maybe he was like pocketing leftover hot dogs from games and taking them home or something, and that's a new type of fraud. I don't know. But I think basically we're coming to a point where the courts or the courts, Congress, the NFL, like, they're all going to kind of have to decide, okay, here's what we're going to do. And based off of that decision, here's how we're going to move forward. And ultimately, someone's not going to be happy, right? Because Dan Snyder essentially is either going to be forced to sell his team and make a whole bunch of money, or he's going to be left in power and everybody's going to be upset there. I think people will be more upset if he still remains the owner of the Washington Commanders. And I think from an NFL standpoint, while the bottom line is not struggling from a holistic standpoint, I think they're starting to realize that, like, hey, having guys like this within our ranks is not helping us make even more money. And let's not get it twisted. These billionaires are not here because they're okay with making a few $100,000 more than the NBA. They want to make billions on top of what the NBA, Major League Baseball, et cetera, are making. And if they can make an extra billion a piece, they want to do that. So if somebody, aka, or, i.e. Dan Snyder, is preventing them from doing so, they don't like it. And honestly, Chris, I think that the revelation that not only was he doing all this other stuff and was all this other stuff happening to his staff members under his watch and everything, I think the fact that he ripped off the other owners has a part to do with this, because now it's one thing if you're in the club and you're pointing out from the club and, abusing or neglecting or laughing at everybody else. It's another thing to be in the club and also be neglecting and laughing at the club itself. Again, I doubt that Dan's probably the only one doing it, but as of right now, he's the only one being caught. I think what we're getting to is a crossroads between how much does Dan know and how dangerous is that from other owners, and how much is it worth it, even if he tries to air some stuff out just to get rid of him.
Well, there's a couple of things at play here, and I'll try and make this as quickly as we can. We still don't know the results of the Mary Jo White second investigation that the NFL is orchestrating.
We don't know them.
We don't know. Maybe they know, and maybe that's what led some of these anonymous owners and the one strongest one, because that was the strongest comments of, we need to get him out. We need to convince him to sell. We need to, get 24 votes together and all that stuff. Maybe they know. We don't know yet, but we will know at some point when the results of those investigations are announced. We just don't know when. So that's number one. Number two, it's interesting. Remember the I don't know if you pay much attention to this, the Robert Sarver situation with the Phoenix Suns in the NBA last week. He was fined $10 million, same as Dan. He was suspended 1 year. But then there was so much vitriol from LeBron James and the NBA Players Association that he just decided to sell, right? And I'm sure internal strife and internal push. He wasn't voted out, but he decided to put the teams up for sale. Yeah. As soon as that happened, I heard from somebody directly involved, and I can't say the name. I heard from somebody directly involved in this whole mess who said, we both know, meaning to me via text, we both know that there's an owner who's done a lot worse than Robert Sarver. And this is a guy who's accused of some really unsavory things. So, here's the bottom line. I'll just say it like this. I think this is like a snowball that is slowly turning into basically an avalanche, and we are going downhill, and we are picking up speed, and we are picking up more snow and more ice and more power and more force. Where it will end, and like you said, how long it will take, I don't know that, but I would say that we have more positive momentum than ever. And one other quick thing, Jerry Jones's role in all of this is so important because Jerry has always had Dan's back. If Jerry turns on Dan, that's a different story.
Yeah, that might be the first conversation these owners need to do, is get together and go talk to Jerry and kind of appeal to his sense of business and logic versus his friendship and loyalty to Dan Snyder, who has obviously not returned said friendship and loyalty back, because again, he not like with everything else he did, he also ripped off Jerry Jones. Like this, it's not like Dallas got their slice of the Washington pie and everybody else got stiffed. No, Jerry Jones got stiffed as well. So interesting to see what's going to come of that. But here's what I do know, Chris. In 6 months' time, Robert Sarver people will say like, oh yeah, I remember that. This has been going on for over 2 years. So this is my second year covering this team, and it was going on before I got here. So this thing has been going on for over 2 years. The NFL could have been over this 18 months ago had they just done the right thing in the beginning. But hey, that's the difference between the NBA and NFL as far as how that works today. But we have another product, another friend, Prize Picks, that do things a little bit differently in a positive way, kind of like the way that the NBA seems to work with these things. And it's very simple. It's a positive way for you to play daily fantasy football. All you got to do is you pick 2 to 5 players, so 2, 3, 4, or 5. And if they score more or less than their Prize Picks projection, you win money. All you got to do is predict, are they going to do more, or are they going to do less than what Prize Picks says they're going to do? So, for example, if next Sunday against the Dallas Cowboys, you think Carson Wentz is going to throw more than 235.4 yards against the Dallas Cowboys, you put Carson in your lineup, you pick more than that projection, you pick at least one other player, you pick more or less that projection at running backs, receivers, you can do combined receiving and rushing yards, a lot of things. And if you're correct, you win money. In fact, you can win up to 10 times your money on one single entry. And the greatest thing is you and your best friend and your best friend's buddy can all play, and you can all win because you're not competing against them. It's just you versus the projections. And if you want to just enjoy your NFL Sunday and Monday and Thursday, you don't want to put any money on it and stretch yourself out, they got NBA, baseball, hockey, golf, disc golf is available. Cricket, if you know what that is, that's available. And the best part is when you win money, you get safe and fast withdrawals with our friends over at Prize Picks, currently operating over 30 states and Canada. So download the Prize Picks app or go to prizepicks.com to sign up and play daily fantasy sports. First-time users, you can receive a 100% instant deposit match up to $100 by using the promo code Locked On. If you deposit $100, they'll deposit $100. Anything less than $100, they'll match it again up to $100. So that promo code Locked On to sign up for that instant deposit at Prize Picks.
All right, once again, thanks, Commanders fans, for making us your first listen and your first view of the day. So, David, we also had another monster story. Is it the Dan Snyder potential ouster and momentum story wasn't big enough? No. We woke up Sunday morning, and I had heard some rumors about this certainly last week that something was coming out along that line, and I had heard some rumblings over the offseason, but just wasn't able to get enough smoke on it. Adam Schefter of ESPN, who, of course, is the preeminent NFL insider, whether you like Adam, you don't like Adam, whatever you think of his ethics. And there's a lot there, right? He reported on Sunday morning, right before Carson Wentz went against his former team, that the Commanders had worked out the arrangement of a trade, not for Carson Wentz, no, but before that for Jimmy Garoppolo at the Combine, and ultimately pulled the plug on the deal because they were told, and it turned out to be true, that Jimmy G was going to have off-season shoulder surgery. So apparently that's when they moved on to Carson Wentz, or their pursuit of Carson Wentz. And mind you, this was also after reportedly showing interest and trying to put together a deal and maybe making a offer for Russell Wilson, at the time still with the Seahawks, before he went to Denver. So, of course, Ron Rivera was asked about this after a very disheartening loss, and he said, quote, and David, you were there, so I'm going to ask you for your visceral reaction, if you will. He said, quote, "You guys, this was a bullcrap report," just so everybody understands that. He goes, "Okay, I didn't talk about that. I'm not sure where it all came from. I'm disappointed it came out like that, especially before today's game." He said, "I really am, because I didn't talk to anybody about Jimmy Garoppolo. The timing is what really upsets me." Yeah. And here's my point, David, before I let you give your responses. Ron didn't have to talk to somebody in order for this to come out. Right. Nobody's accusing Ron of leaking this. Why would Ron leak this? It looks bad for the Commanders, quite honestly. But you were there when he said it. What was your reaction to what he said?
I was honestly surprised that he was as offended by it as he was. But I get what he's saying as far as the timing of it, right? Like, why is this coming out Sunday morning? Like, listen, we've been accused of this, Chris, you and I. Mm-hmm. I'm sure you get accused of it on the radio as well. Oh, yeah. I get accused of it in my writing and stuff every once in a while. And you get the comments or you get the tweets, right? And they always say, what? Man, it must be a slow news day, right? It's like, oh, you wrote about Jonathan Allen's favorite ice cream flavor. Man, must be a slow news day, right? Or I don't know, Deron Payne didn't show up to Terry McLaurin's birthday party. Man, must be a slow news day. I got it. Sundays in the regular season for the National Football, like Sundays from like August to the end of February, never a slow news day. Mm-hmm. Never anything short of like if I wanted to write 10 articles in one day about one team, I could do it. I could probably do it about one player if I really wanted to. So the report didn't need to drop Sunday, right? The report could have dropped Monday. It could have dropped Tuesday. Chris, it could have dropped Wednesday, which is probably the slowest news day of the week. Actually, Tuesday is probably the slowest news day, I think, right? Unless you're playing Monday Night Football, probably Tuesday, because the team's usually off. There's no press conferences, stuff like that. So I think what Ron's point was, and what he was actually upset about, is that it dropped as they're preparing to play not only a divisional game, but they're also preparing to play Carson Wentz's former team.
Correct.
And remember who Carson Wentz is. Remember the stories about Carson Wentz, right? Mentally fragile, not super confident, doesn't like, being outed kind of in the media, doesn't like being embarrassed to the public face and all that stuff, right? And you kind of go back to the interview that Scott Abram had with him, where he kind of brought up, hey, Carson, some people are saying things about training camp and you're not doing so well. And Jason Wright kind of lashed out at him and said, hey, man, like, what is that? And a lot of people didn't really see an issue with the question, kind of giving Carson the opportunity to acknowledge the speculation or the storyline, and then contradict it by saying, and I think what he said was, it's training camp, it's practice, we're getting to know each other. He explained it away. I think he did a really good job. The thing that I said about it is this. I get why Ron's upset about the timing of it. We're literally getting ready to go play this game. Why do you got to drop it now? You don't need this. You don't need the clicks. Drop it on Tuesday, basically. But my thing is Carson Wentz, and I've never been an NFL quarterback, but far be it for me to tell Carson Wentz how to be an NFL quarterback. At his worst, he's more successful doing it than I ever will be. But if I'm Carson Wentz, or if I'm just a guy on the day of one of the biggest days of my career, I'm not reading the press clippings.
No.
Like, I'm not on ESPN.com. You know what I mean? I'm thinking about my playbook. I'm thinking about my game plan. Maybe I'm talking to Scott about some last minute adjustments. I'm talking to my receivers about some things to look for. Like, I'm not reading ESPN.com, especially knowing it's Commanders Eagles. Like, he knows what the storyline is. He got asked about it all week. Are you nervous about it? Are you anticipating? Are you excited? So he knows what the story is. So what do you, if you're Carson Wentz and you open up ESPN.com, what do you expect to see? You expect to see stuff about you and Philly. None of it's going to be positive. You know what I mean? Now, what do you see? You see the Washington Commanders pursuing Jimmy Garoppolo before you. But again, you go back to the offseason, Chris. I mean, I saw people writing up, did the Washington Commanders ask the Chiefs if Patrick Mahomes was available? Because remember, at one point they had said they literally, like, the report was that they called literally all 31 NFL teams about available quarterbacks. So if Carson is surprised, and nobody's saying that he was, but if he's upset about Carson possibly seeing that before the game, if Carson were to see it and were to be surprised that the Commanders kicked the tires on other quarterbacks before trading for him, then he just ain't paying attention. But at the end of the day, it don't matter because he's in burgundy, Jimmy G's in gold, and that's just what it is.
Well, I would say the only difference is the way the story was written and said,
they had an agreement in place.
Was they had an agreement in place.
But Carson wasn't ever the first choice. Like Russell Wilson.
And he should know that, right?
Yeah,
to your point, Russell Wilson was probably the number one. And listen, I going way back to what we talked about last October and November. I mean, Aaron Rodgers was really and ideally kind of like the dream, type, and that went nowhere. Anyway, the bottom line is if Carson Wentz is that thin skin that he's not the number one choice, well, you know what? That's part of the problem too. Number one. Number two, just to counter what you said, and I got to be honest with you, I don't have any problem with what Adam Schefter did because Adam Schefter probably had a conversation with a source. I think I know who the source is.
And he didn't say it came from Washington, but I get Ron saying I had nothing to do with it, basically just to tell everybody, look, this didn't come from me.
Right.
But Adam didn't say Washington had anything to do with the story anyway, and in the first place.
Exactly. It could be somebody on Jimmy G's side, right? That, Adam was calling about, hey, is there anything cooking for a contract extension with San Francisco, being that Trey Lance is out, Jimmy G is starting, Jimmy G's playing on Sunday Night Football, blah, 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 blah. Anyway, the point of the matter is Adam is under no responsibility to hold off for Ron's sake or for Carson's sake for Tuesday, Wednesday, Monday, Sunday night, whatever, because he works for ESPN. His job is to get people to watch Sunday NFL Countdown. You know how you do that? With a big bombshell news story on a Sunday morning. That's how you get him to do that. Number one. Number two, and I'll just say this, right? Remember, the Snyders, Ron's bosses, have spoon-fed Adam Schefter all sorts of news, all sorts of interviews, all sorts of access, including yesterday morning when they wanted to parade around the railing, the new railing that collapsed when Jalen Hurts was last at FedEx Field. They were all over that with Adam Schefter. So here you have your ownership, your president, basically spoon-feeding Adam Schefter all sorts of information and interviews and access, and now the coach is upset at Adam Schefter for reporting something at a bad time or an inconvenient time. So you know what? Here's the deal. I'll just say this. Everybody pipe down and worry about winning football games before you start worrying about what the media has to say. That's just my 2 cents on it, David.
Yeah, I mean, I get where Ron's coming from, but again, Adam did nothing wrong. He did his job, and if ESPN is happy with him, then he did it well.
Absolutely.
It is what it is. But again,
I'm sure ESPN was thrilled with him because, of course, generated a lot of buzz. And I'll have some different thoughts on that on the next episode and whether or not that would have been a good thing. I want to get into more of that, but as time allows. Coming up next, some Sunday not so superlatives for the Commanders and what the analysts were saying. That is next right here as we wrap things up on the Locked On Commanders podcast.
All right, final segment here on the Locked On Commanders podcast. Sunday not so superlatives. I love that title of the segment, Chris. Kudos to you. We're looking at the Commanders and what other analysts are or were saying about the Washington Commanders. We've got breakdowns from Brian Baldinger, Ross Tucker, and Duke Manyweather on the Twitter webpage feed. So make sure you go to LO Commanders on Twitter, most likely on an app. I don't know why I said webpage. I'm not that old, guys. But go to @LO Commanders. Chris has put up some good stuff up there, including something from RG3, who it's like the I don't even know what to call it. He just won't go away. He said, quote, Carson didn't navigate the pressure well. The O-line wasn't great, and offensive coordinator Scott Turner didn't adjust fast enough. Turner needs to run the ball and move the pocket early once it was clear they were off in the drop back game. Right. End quote. Chris, where have we heard we need more designed pocket movement from the quarterback position before?
Well, I think we've talked about it. I believe, I'm strong sense that we have. And here's the other thing. I'll just say this. Robert's right. I mean, they needed to run the football more because you know what? What happened, David, when they ran the football in the first half, and I don't know if we got deep enough into this in our post-game immediate reaction. When they ran the football in the first half, they ran it really, really, really well on first down. I mean, there was a 15-yard run on the very first play of the game, little jet motion, Curtis Samuel 15. Antonio Gibson opened up a series. I think it was the third series, or maybe it was the fourth series of the game with a +11 run on first down. There were runs of 7, 8, 5, 4. There was one run of 3, whereas the passing game got them absolutely nothing except for one completion, catch and run of 16 yards. They were sacked once, a bunch of incompletions on first down. We all know the passing game didn't work. We all know they couldn't hold up in pass protection. Carson holding on to the ball too long, all the different problems. We'll get more into that again throughout the week as we continue to pick through the tape and the reaction. But the bottom line is, Robert's right. They didn't do, of course, enough things to counter what Philadelphia was doing. And David, that leads us into our next point. And that was from Sheil Kapidia of The Ringer, who used to cover the Philadelphia Eagles long ago. But he pointed out, and this is courtesy of Pro Football Focus and True Media, that 7 of the Eagles' 9 sacks on Sunday came without blitzing. And that was tied for the most sacks produced with a 4-man rush in a regular season NFL game over the past 3 years. And David, you and I were both there, and we sat next to each other in the press box. And I think we both remarked at some point to each other, they're doing this with a 4-man rush. They blitzed Kirk Cousins and the Vikings last Monday night like 11 or 12 times. And that was way more than Jonathan Gagnon normally does. And they didn't have to blitz yesterday to get home. Yeah. It was a turnstile consistently.
Yeah. And they blitzed Jared Goff and the Detroit Lions and didn't get home as much as they did against Washington. Yeah, it was a rough day, which is why Wes Schweitzer talking about PFF. Wes Schweitzer, the lowest graded Commanders offensive player. The highest graded, Sam Cosmi, which was interesting. But he actually, it's interesting, right? Because Sam Cosmi actually had the third lowest pass protection grade on the line. But ultimately was the highest graded offensive player because of his run blocking, which goes into what you're talking about, which goes into what RG3 is talking about, which goes into what other people are talking about. Chris, something I talked about before the game was the running game, specifically, was Jonathan Williams. Not saying he needs to be the starter or be the lion's share of carries, right? But he is more of a Brian Robinson type back than Antonio Gibson is, than JD McKissic is. It's not a dig, it's just facts, right? So it's like, I'm interested to see if Jonathan Williams gets in there and gets some carries and maybe gets going. He did get a carry pretty early on, 6-yard run. I was like, all right, that worked pretty well.
When did that come on? Third and
that was like a third and something, and
I think it was
6
yards.
Third and
one.
Was it third and one? Yeah, it was third and something.
Sure
but, I was just excited to see him out. I was like, oh man, that worked pretty well. Let's see when that happens again, Chris. The next time it happens again will be the next time it happens again, because Jonathan Williams finished the game with 1 carry for 6 yards.
I know. I don't understand what they're doing. This to me is a stubbornness on Scott Turner to want to use a quarterback with a howitzer of an arm and 3 very quick jitterbug receivers, but to not use them the right way, David, and to use them on medium and intermediate and longer developing routes when you can't hold up in pass pro. And I love Pro Football Focus. Listen, Cosme was terrible in pass protection. I don't care what you want to say about his run blocking. I don't care. He was awful in pass protection. And I'll go back to our walk-off episode last week to pat myself on the back, because we always have to when we're right. My X-Factor player of the game was Wes Schweitzer. And it was because I was scared to death of all the line calls, the shifting against Hargrave, against Fletcher Cox. And I'm not saying he was the only bad one. He was bad. Snaps, pass pro, everything. That's not really his strength. He's not a center. He can play center. He's not a center. What they need to do is the kid that they signed last week, or the young man that they signed last week, Nick Martin, they need to have him start at center this Sunday. And all of these guys, I'll just say this, all of them, Charles Leno was terrible yesterday, or I should say Sunday as well. Andrew Norwell, Trey Turner, they were all turnstiles. They all stunk. Wentz stunk too. The game plan stunk. Everybody needs to step up. I'm sorry if that offends anybody's feelings, but I'm tired of lightly dancing around a dysfunctional disaster. And it's a brewing. And by the way, assuming that they don't get hurt on Monday night, DeMarcus Lawrence and Micah Parsons are coming to AT&T Stadium, where you'll be next Sunday. Yeah,
Micah Parsons is so good, so dangerous, so scary if you're Carson Wentz this week. Look, so you went as far as to say that Wes Schweitzer shouldn't be starting. I'm not saying that Jonathan Williams should be like the starting. Again, I'm not saying you should supplant Antonio Gibson, nothing like that, until Brian Robinson comes. I'm just saying you get a guy in there for 1 carry, 6 yards. I mean, you expect you're gonna go back to that at least 2 or 3 times, see if you can't get something going. Instead, they didn't do that. But Chris, a lot of talk about from this game. Unfortunately, a lot of negatives. You're not the only one who's super frustrated. I don't know, super frustrated with this team, but some not so superlative Sunday not so superlative. Let me do that again. Some Sunday not so superlatives for the Washington Commanders. I think we're gonna have to make that an every losing week tradition. We've got our game balls, and we'll have some we'll come up with something for the wins. But I think that's a beautiful way to end this final super dive into what just happened this weekend.
We can do whatever we want, because you know why? It's our show.
It is our show.
Okay. So who's to tell us?
It's not the Washington Commanders show.
No.
It's not the NFL show.
Absolutely not. Exactly. All right. Either way, we will have more coverage throughout the week. Of course, we'll see if they make any roster moves, and we'll see if they make any inclination towards any starting lineup changes. And maybe we'll see that with Martin at center. I don't know. We'll have to see. As we go through the week, we will have coverage of that. But thanks again, Commanders fans, for making the Locked On Commanders podcast your first listen and your first view of the day. Now make your second listen and view the Peacock and Williamson NFL show with Brian Peacock and former NFL scout Matt Williamson, giving you the expert NFL analysis in less than 30 minutes. It's free and available wherever you get your podcast. We'll be back. I'll be solo with an episode. Again, we'll break down more of the Jimmy G, Carson Wentz decision and much, much more on that next particular episode. Then David will be back with Crossover Thursday, and then we'll reconvene before the end of the week and the Dallas Cowboys at AT&T Stadium. If you want to hop in, 301-615-3577 or LockedOnWashingtonCommanders@gmail.com. But again, the voicemail 301-615-3577 for my partner David Harrison, covering the Washington Commanders for SI.com's Fan Nation and Commanders Country. Chris Russell, one half of the Russell and Medhurst show on the Team 980. If you're out and about, please be safe, be kind to one another. Don't you dare drive like a maniac. And thank you for joining us right here on the Locked On Commanders podcast.